There is a beautiful legend that says if one drinks from the waters of the mighty Nile River, one is destined to return to Egypt sometime in their life. More likely, if one drinks the waters from the River Nile, they're going to get wretchedly ill. And so was the case for myself as my plane brought me into Bombay, India at midnight during the middle of the monsoon season, temperature about 95 degrees, humidity probably the same. I was about to die. It was the summer of 1981, and I, a somewhat naive American of 26 years old, was backpacking solo around the world. And on this particular leg of my journey, I was traveling from Cairo, Egypt, to Bombay, India. Of course, today, that's Mumbai, India, but I digress. The fact was, our plane made a stopover in the capital of the United Arab Emirates. That's Dubai. And I did. You see, according to my guidebook, it told me that if I were to buy this certain list of items and take them with me when I got into India, I could turn around and sell them for a hefty profit and probably be able to finance at least another year of my journey just in India alone. So what did I buy? Well, the book told me to buy at least a dozen bottles of Johnnie Walker Red, Black Label, and at least a dozen cartons of Marlboro cigarettes, hardpack. So I did. It also said if you're really interested in making some money, you should buy yourself a tape recorder. So I looked around and I found one. It was quite expensive, but then again I kept thinking, this is going to finance my whole trip through India, so why worry? So how was I to know that the customs regulations had changed while I was en route to India? So I made my way off of the plane, in through the terminal, into this humongous airport, found my way to the baggage claim center, grabbed my backpack, and headed for the customs agent's desk. And that's when I saw the sign that said, "Attention, customs regulations have changed." Well, that got me wondering, what did they change to? Well, as I inched closer in the line to the customs agent's booth, I noticed another sign that said, "Limit of 2 Johnnie Walker Red. Limit 2 Marlboro Light cigarette cartons." And I'm thinking, oh God, what am I going to do with all the stuff I have in my backpack? So I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. I turned to the other passengers waiting on the line in back of me, and I started asking them, would you please take these extra bottles of Johnnie Walker Red and these extra cartons of Marlboro Light cigarettes and then give them to me later after you've gone through customs? To my surprise, they all said yes. So I inched my way up and finally arrived at the booth where the custom agent was, and he asked me the typical questions, and he asked me what I had to declare. That's when I showed him that I only had 2 bottles of Johnnie Walker Red and only 2 cartons of Marlboro cigarettes, and he said, great, now what about that tape recorder? What? What about my tape recorder? So he takes my tape recorder from me, flips it over, looks at the serial number, and proceeds to write that serial number in the back of my passport. He hands the passport back to me, and then he ends the conversation with a stern warning: if you do not have that tape recorder in your possession when you leave this country, we shall fine you 10 times the assessed value for your tape recorder. Well, that certainly changes my plans. To my surprise and relief, every one of the passengers that I had given my items to prior to the declarations came forth and were giving me back my bottles, my Johnny Walker Red, my Marlboro cigarettes, and I was like, oh wow, these people are so honest. I must have spent at least a year working on a list of places to see and things to do on my journey around the world. And on that list, it included a stopover in India to visit an ashram. Now, an ashram is a spiritual center where one goes to work on their enlightenment. And that was exactly what I planned to do. The only problem was, that being 1981, without the internet, it was difficult, in fact, it was impossible for me to have located an ashram for me to visit. So I put it up to fate. I said, if God wants me to find an ashram, I'll find an ashram. So having made it through customs, with my Johnny Walker Reds and my Marlboro boxes and my tape recorder, I headed out in search of a phone. Why? Because I was going to call my longtime pen pal, Shyam. Shyam was supposed to meet me at the airport upon my call, and he was going to show me around India. What more could I ask for? Upon leaving the airport terminal, I was immediately approached by a young Indian boy who came up to me and started whispering, "Black market, black market, black market?" And I'm thinking, wow, this is easy. I'm going to make a killing. He proceeded to explain to me that anyone caught participating in black market activity was likely to go to jail. So I immediately divested myself of my Johnny Walker Red and my cigarettes for a very small profit. But at least I wasn't going to be going to jail. I kept the tape recorder, however, thinking, I may be able to use this. So I finally found a phone, and I dialed up the number of my pen pal, Shyam, only to find out that his number had been recently disconnected. Plan B. The phone may have changed, but maybe he still lives at the same address. So I walked out onto the curb and I flagged down a cab. I gave him the address that I wanted to go to, and he said, no problem. He grabbed my backpack, threw it in the back, and off we went into the night. In about 20 minutes' time, we arrived on this very long street that had row houses, one after another, and all of them looked alike. My cabbie pulled over, put my backpack on the sidewalk, and he asked to be paid. And I said, well, excuse me, could you tell me which house I'm looking for? And he says, well, the house you want, just a couple doors down. Oh, no problem, I thought. I paid him. He drove off, and I went looking for Shyam's house, which wasn't to be found because we weren't on the right street. I walked to the end of the block, flagged down another cabbie, and I said, I need to go to this address. And this time I showed him my address book, thinking maybe the other cabbie misunderstood what I had said to him. Well, no problem. Takes my backpack, throws it in the back of the seat. We drive off into the night. About 20 minutes later, we arrive on another street that looked very much like the one I had just been on before. Row houses, one after another. And he says to me, there, that's the house that you're looking for. And he pointed to one, so I said, okay, great, he knows where we were going this time. Puts my backpack on the corner, I give him my money, he drives off. It's not Shyam's house. Okay, enough with the cabs, I thought. Perhaps my friend Shyam has actually moved. What I need to find is a telephone directory. So where would I find one of those? Well, let's ask the policeman. There was one on the corner. He directed me down the block to Victoria Terminus, the big train station. When I got there and I walked in, I immediately went to the office of the train director. He ushered me into his office and he showed me a stack of telephone directories, each one of them at least a foot tall, laying in the corner. And he said, "Who are you looking for?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for my pen pal, Shyam." And at that point, I took my little address book out and I handed it to him. Well, he took my address book and turned back to page 1, read through the entries, turned the page, read those entries, turned the page again, and continued to do that until he got to the very end of the book. When he finished, he said, "The telephone directories are not updated very often, and it's very doubtful that you're going to find your pen pal listed in those books. Plan C. Let's find something to eat before I drop dead." There were several restaurants I could see on an upper level, and I said, okay, great. Let's get to the elevator, let's go up there and get a bite to eat and think about what Plan C is going to be. When the elevator doors parted and I dragged myself into the compartment as best I could, I noticed that there were a couple, a man and a woman in their mid-20s, also on their way up to the second floor. They must have taken pity on me and my condition, and they said, "Do you need some help? Are you okay?" Well, that was my introduction to Terry and Tomia, my guardian angels. By the time the elevator reached the next floor, Terry, Tomia, and I had become the best of friends. That happens when you're traveling around the world. So Terry and Tomia sit down at a table and they gesture to me to grab a chair and join them. I look around, I find this chair, and just as I'm about to take it, I look up and there's a waiter. So wanting to be polite and not offend, I said to him, "May I take this chair?" And he goes, "So was that yes or no? May I take this chair?" And he goes, a little bit more adamantly, and still not quite sure, I said, "May I take this?" "Take the chair!" he screams at me. So during the course of the meal, I learned that Terry and Tomia are on their way north to the city of Pune to visit their good friend David, who has been spending the year on an ashram. Yes, an ashram. Upon our train's arrival into Pune, we were instantly greeted by David, Terry and Tomia's best friend. David, with his long brown hair, his flowing gowns of reds and oranges, he was a picture of the quintessential hippie. Around his neck was a large beaded chain that culminated in this very large picture about at his navel. I later found out that that's called a mala, and disciples wear a mala to show their allegiance to a particular mentor or guru. As it turned out, David was a sannyasin, or disciple, of the spiritual leader known as Sri Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and was staying and studying at his local ashram, the place that we would be staying at. So over the course of the next 3 weeks, David, Terry, Tomia, and I spent every waking hour in meditation, in deep spiritual discussion, and when we weren't doing that, We were hiking, biking, and eating this fabulous vegetarian cuisine that was offered at the ashram. It was an idyllic setting, one that was sure to hasten my journey towards enlightenment. I was so impressed with the environment of spiritual discovery, the camaraderie of my friends. I decided I was going to take the mala. I was going to wear this chain that said, I am a disciple of Sri Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Unfortunately, at least for David, over the next couple of days, I discovered that my guru-to-be, Mr. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, was actually on the run from the Indian authorities and was currently in America seeking a new location to build his ashram. No way was I going to take the mala at this point. So when I decided not to take it, Terry decided not to take it. And when Terry decided not to take it, Tomia decided not to take it. And when the three of us decided not to take the mala, David promptly threw us out of his apartment at which we had been staying. Having been thrown out of David's house, Terry, Tomia, and I found ourselves at a cafe trying to plot the next leg of our journey. Terry came up with this wonderful idea that the three of us ought to travel north to this idyllic mountain area called Kashmir. Now, I had never heard of Kashmir, except as a sweater, but I was willing to put my faith in this man because, after all, he had saved me back at the airport, and I felt that I owed him something. Plus, our rapport had grown so strong that why not? Why not spend some time up in Kashmir? Upon our arrival in Kashmir, the first thing I noticed was that there was a very, very large lake called Lake Dal. And on that very large lake, there were dozens of these triple-story Victorian houseboats, all brightly painted as if you had been in the city of San Francisco. As it turns out, the British had built these elegant triple-story Victorian houseboats during their period of occupation of India, all to get around the regulations that stated that the Brits were not permitted to own land. These houseboats had since been turned into floating hotels. So Terry and Tomia rented one floating houseboat. I rented the one next door. The good news was that the price of our houseboat included our meals. The bad news, however, was that our plates and our silverware were being washed right in Lake Dal, the same place, I found out, that our toilets were flushing into. So naturally, within a couple of days, I came down with a wretched case of dysentery and spent the next week dying in my cabin. Sadly, the day did finally come when Terry, Tomia, and I decided it was time for us to part. They were going to go on their journey back to Great Britain. I was destined for New Delhi. So I returned to my houseboat and I informed my proprietor that I was going to be checking out. How much did I owe him? And he looked at me and said, "No, I want your tape recorder." I said, No. I can't give you the tape recorder because its serial number is written in my passport and I need to show it when I leave the country. And he goes, No. Everyone does that in India. And what you do to get around it is you simply go down to the police station and you report the tape recorder as having been stolen. During my train ride into Delhi, I was fortunate to have shared a cabin with a middle-aged man and woman who were just delightful. They were asking me all sorts of questions about my American culture, and I got to ask them questions about India. Well, everything went very smoothly until they turned to me and said, "So tell us, what is your favorite American food?" Upon which I replied, "Hamburgers." At which time they proceeded to explain to me that in India, cows are sacred. By the time I arrived in New Delhi, I was in a spiritual sweat. On one hand, I had come to the country to seek enlightenment, and indeed, I had spent a couple of weeks on an ashram and truly felt that I was beginning to make some progress. On the other hand, I now had a tape recorder that had to be reported as stolen. In other words, I had to lie through my teeth to the Indian authorities. What was that going to do to my karma? In my final day in New Delhi, indeed, my final day in India, I decided to take a quick train ride down to the city of Agra and check out the gloriously beautiful Taj Mahal. Now here is a building that had been built as a monument to love, and it was as beautiful as anyone had ever told me. The walls of this monument were jewel encrusted with semi-precious stones that glittered in the sunlight. Truly a breathtaking sight to see. Leaving the Taj Mahal, I got back on my train, headed back for New Delhi, dreading the fact that I was finally going to have to report my tape recorder. Suddenly, I had this brilliant flash of the story that I can tell this policeman about how my tape recorder had gotten stolen. Upon arriving back in New Delhi, I jumped off the train and flagged down a rickshaw driver and said, "Take me to the police station." Of course, he turned to me and said, "Why do you want to go to the police station?" And I figured, well, I might as well try my story out on him and see how it plays. So I turned to him and said, earlier, while I was down in Agra looking at the gorgeous Taj Mahal, I put my tape recorder down on the ground and began to take pictures. And lo and behold, when I looked back down to get my tape recorder, it was gone. He'd said, "No, this is a story you should tell them. Today, when I was on the train coming back from Agra to Delhi, I left my compartment for the restroom. When I got back to my compartment, I noticed that my tape recorder had been stolen. I figured, wow, that's a great story. But in the end, I decided I'd stick with my own anyway." Having arrived at the police station, pleased with the story I was about to tell, I confidently marched to the front doors and asked to see the sergeant in charge. "Why do you need to see him?" they asked me. And I said, "I have a tape recorder that has been stolen and I need to report it." "Okay," he told me, "sit down and we'll get the officer." Within a few minutes, an officer arrived and he sat down and took a seat across the desk from me. He asked me why I was there, and I told him, "I need to report my tape recorder. It was stolen today." And he goes, "Oh, really? Tell me, how did it happen?" So I recounted my story about how I was in Agra and how I put my tape recorder down on the ground and how I was taking pictures of the beautiful Taj Mahal and that when I got done, etc., etc. Well, he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry. If your tape recorder was stolen in Agra, you must return to Agra to report it." Totally dismayed, I slunk back in my chair and I guess I looked like I was gonna cry because within a moment or two the officer did a ch-ch-ch-ch-ch and I got closer and he said, "Let me tell you what to do." I said, "What?" He says, "You go down to the other police department across town and this is the story that you tell them." And he proceeded to give me the story that the rickshaw driver had told me. The one about having come back to New Delhi, having left my compartment on the train, coming back and finding my tape recorder stolen. I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. So with a renewed sense of confidence, I left the police station, flagged down a new rickshaw driver, and I said, take me to the police department across town. As we were driving, as expected, he wanted to know why. So I figured, what the heck, I'll try out my new story. After I told him, he pulled the rickshaw over to the side of the road and he said, no, this is the story that you must tell them. Yesterday, when my train arrived back in New Delhi and I got off of it, I suddenly realized that my tape recorder was still on the train. And when I got back into my compartment, it was gone. And I'm figuring, wow, another great story. But I think I'll stick with the story that the other police officer had told me. So we arrive at the new police station. I confidently walk through the doors, knowing that I have the finest story to tell him. And I ask to see the officer in charge. Within a few minutes, another Sikh arrives. He sits down at the desk across from me, and I begin to recount my tale about how I was on the train back from Agra. I had gone to the bathroom, left my compartment. When I got back to the compartment, lo and behold, my tape recorder was gone. He looked at me in a dismissive sort of way with his incredibly piercing eyes that sort of looked through my soul as if I were looking at the eyes of God. And of course, I had to wonder which God, because here in India, there are so many to choose from. So he hands me this piece of paper and a pencil and he says, take this down. Today, when I was coming back from Agra, my train arrived in Delhi. I jumped off the train and suddenly realized that my tape recorder was not in my possession. So I frantically went back onto the train, checked my compartment, and it was gone. Well, why didn't I think of that? So having filed my bogus report, and in the process having done untold damage to my soul, my karma, and everything else, I promptly hopped on a bus, headed for the northern frontier with Nepal, and got ready to show my passport with my letter of explanation of why my tape recorder was no longer in my possession. Imagine my surprise that when we got to the border, the agent took my passport, opened it up, checked my photo, it matched, closed my passport, gave it back to me and said, proceed. In retrospect, I had journeyed countless thousands of miles to come to the land of India to seek spiritual enlightenment and learn the ways of the masters. But in actuality, what I ended up learning was how to tell a really good lie. And then I found myself at the shop selling saris, women's dresses. And they were so beautiful, in fact, that I walked in to have a better look. Just as I did, a middle-aged woman came in and grabbed up one of the saris that was on the table. It was a particularly beautiful one at that. And as she was examining it, Yet another woman walks in. She goes and grabs the sari from her hands and takes it. I'm thinking, this is mighty strange. And if that wasn't bad enough, a third woman walks in and takes it from her. And before you know it, the three of them are having a brawl in the middle of the store. Each one of them wants the sari. So suddenly the proprietor rushes over, afraid that something's going to happen, and he goes to grab it from their arms. As he does, the material rips in two. I started thinking to myself, Connie Francis, like, who's sorry now?